At 9 o'clock on the night of Sunday, the 15th of August, 1971, the President of the United States interrupted Bonanza, one of the most popular programs on American television, to announce that he was changing what money is. Richard Nixon spoke from the Oval Office for less than 20 minutes. Most of the speech was standard political furniture, jobs, taxes, a swipe at speculators. But buried in the middle was a single sentence that ended a promise the United States had made to the entire world. And with it, the last connection between the money in anyone's pocket, anywhere on earth, and gold. Here is the arithmetic that forced his hand. Foreign governments and central banks were holding more than $40 billion, dollars America had sworn by treaty it would redeem in gold on demand at $35 an ounce. The gold actually sitting behind that promise had shrunk to roughly $10 billion. The United States was, in the plainest banking terms, a bank facing a run, and that August, the run had started. This is the story of the Nixon Shock, the elegant machine built in a New Hampshire hotel in 1944, the flaw sealed into its foundations from the first day, the decade of duct tape and gold ships that followed, and the secret weekend at Camp David when roughly 15 men, sworn to silence, cut off from the world, dismantled the world's monetary system between a Friday afternoon and a Sunday night. It is also the answer to one of the most asked questions about money. Why isn't the dollar backed by gold anymore? The short answer is because of this weekend. The long answer is better. And it begins 27 years earlier, in the mountains of New Hampshire, with the most ambitious monetary project ever attempted. In July 1944, with the Normandy beachheads barely 5 weeks old, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the money of the post-war world. They had all lived through the same nightmare twice. The gold standards collapse into depression in the 1930s, the currency wars and beggar-thy-neighbor devaluations that followed, and the world war that followed those. Their assignment was to build a system with the discipline of gold, but without its cruelty. The automatic punishment machine, as its critics called it, deliberately left out. The intellectual duel at Bretton Woods was between John Maynard Keynes, negotiating for an exhausted and nearly bankrupt Britain, and Harry Dexter White of the United States Treasury. Keynes wanted a genuinely international currency. He called it banker, issued by a world institution, belonging to no single nation. White wanted the dollar at the center. White had the only functioning economy on earth behind him, and White won. The system they signed worked like a wheel. At the hub, the American dollar, fixed to gold at $35 an ounce, a price Franklin Roosevelt had set back in 1934, with the United States promising to redeem dollars in metal for any foreign government that asked. Around the rim, every other member currency fixed not to gold but to the dollar. The pound, the franc, the mark, the yen, all of them pegged to the dollar, and the dollar alone pegged to gold. One nation's currency had become the world's measuring stick. Notice what this was not. Ordinary citizens could not swap dollars for gold. Americans had been forbidden even to own monetary gold since 1933. The famous gold window at the United States Treasury was open to foreign governments and central banks only. The gold standard the world remembered was already gone. What Bretton Woods built was a gold-anchored dollar standard, resting entirely on one country's willingness and ability to honor one price. And for a generation, it was magnificent. The system presided over the greatest economic expansion in human history. Europe and Japan rebuilt, world trade multiplied, currencies stayed stable for decades at a stretch. The men who ran it could be forgiven for thinking they had solved money. But the machine had a flaw sealed into its foundations, and the man who found it could not make anyone act on it. His name was Robert Triffin, a Belgian economist at Yale, and in 1960 he stood before the United States Congress and explained, with terrible clarity, that the system was built on a contradiction. The world economy was growing, and a growing world needed ever more dollars for trade, for reserves, for the plumbing of international finance. The only way those dollars could get out into the world was for the United States to spend, lend, and invest more abroad than it earned, to run persistent deficits. But every dollar that piled up in foreign vaults was a claim on the same unmoving stock of American gold. The more dollars the world held, the less credible the $35 promise became. The system's fuel was also its poison. Run the deficits, and confidence in gold convertibility must eventually crack. Stop the deficits, and the world would be starved of the money it ran on. There was no setting of the dial that worked forever. Economists came to call it the Triffin dilemma, and it is one of those rare cases where a scholar stood up, predicted the death of a system a decade in advance, described the mechanism precisely, and was thanked, published, and ignored. Because through the 1950s, the numbers still look safe. At its post-war peak, the United States held over $20 billion in gold, more than half of all the monetary gold on Earth. But watch the two lines move. American gold drifting down year after year as Europe recovered and cashed its surpluses, foreign-held dollars climbing relentlessly. Somewhere in the early 1960s, the lines crossed. Foreign dollar claims exceeded the gold behind them. And from that moment, Bretton Woods was, on paper, a bank that could not survive a run. Everything that followed was about preventing anyone from starting one. The first defense was a cartel. In 1961, the United States and 7 European allies formed the London Gold Pool, a joint fund of gold to be sold into the London market whenever the free price of gold rose above $35, forcing it back down. Think about what that means. The official price of gold had become a number that required constant intervention to remain true. The pool was a peg on the world's disbelief. For a few years it held. Then France broke ranks. Charles de Gaulle had concluded that the dollar's position at the center of the system gave America something for nothing, the ability to pay its debts in money it alone could print. His finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, gave the arrangement its immortal name, the exorbitant privilege. And in February 1965, de Gaulle summoned the press and called openly for a return to gold itself. Gold, he said, which has no nationality. France matched words with metal. It began converting its surplus dollars into gold at the Treasury window, hundreds of millions at a time, and carrying the bars home across the Atlantic. A story grew up that a French warship sailed into New York Harbor to collect the gold. The warship may be embellishment, but the shipments themselves were entirely real, and every one of them drained the vault a little further. In 1967, France quietly withdrew from the gold pool altogether. Hold that image, allied nations queuing politely at the counter of a bank they suspect is failing, each hoping to be paid out before the rest, because the queue was about to become a stampede. In November 1967, Britain devalued the pound. That is a saga our British Channel tells in full, along with the 1931 original, and the shockwave went straight through the gold market. If the world's second reserve currency could break its promise, traders reasoned, why not the first? Buyers descended on London, and the gold pool bled. In its final months, the pool was selling gold faster than it could physically be flown in. American military aircraft ferried bullion across the Atlantic, and the story is told that so much metal piled up at the Bank of England that the floor of a weighing room gave way. In March 1968, after losses running to billions of dollars, the pool surrendered. The London gold market was shut for 2 weeks, and when it reopened, the world had agreed to an arrangement of magnificent absurdity: 2 prices for gold. Governments would keep pretending among themselves that gold was worth $35. Everyone else would pay whatever the market said. The official price of gold was now a diplomatic fiction, maintained by mutual agreement not to test it. There was one more attempt to engineer a way out. Washington had spent the decade trying everything short of surgery: taxes on foreign lending, emergency swap lines between central banks, polite pressure on allies to hold their dollars and not ask awkward questions. Then, in 1969, the members of the International Monetary Fund created an entirely new reserve asset, the special drawing right, promptly nicknamed paper gold, an accounting token designed to give the growing world the reserves it needed without demanding more dollars or more metal. It was Triffin's problem being answered, a decade late, by committee. But the SDR arrived timidly and in small amounts, and events had stopped moving at the speed of committees. The two lines on the chart had kept diverging, and by 1971, the gold actually held against foreign official dollar claims had fallen to roughly a quarter of what it would take to pay them. A system reduced to asking its members not to test it is a system waiting for someone impolite. It got 3 more years, and then it got the summer of 1971. By that summer, every gauge on the American dashboard was flashing at once. Inflation, stoked by years of paying for the Vietnam War and the Great Society without raising taxes to match, was running above 4% tame by later standards, alarming then. Unemployment was around 6%, and in 1971, the United States was heading for its first trade deficit since the 19th century. The exporting colossus of the post-war world was now buying more than it sold. Under the rules of Bretton Woods, the remedy for a country in America's position was the old gold standard medicine: squeeze the economy, force prices down, defend the parity. With an election 18 months away, Richard Nixon had no intention of taking that medicine. The markets could count. In May 1971, so many dollars flooded into Germany that the Bundesbank stopped fighting and let the mark float upward. In early August, a congressional subcommittee published what everyone knew and no official had said: the dollar was overvalued. Dollars poured out of the country and into foreign central banks in extraordinary volume. And in the second week of August came the request that, in Washington's telling, tip the scales. Britain, America's closest ally, asked the United States to guarantee a portion of its dollar reserves against devaluation. Accounts differ on the size of the request. Some put it in the billions. What mattered was the meaning. Even the friends were quietly asking to be insured against the promise failing. The run on the bank had reached the counter. On Friday, the 13th of August, 1971, Nixon summoned his economic high command to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. What happened there over the next 60 hours was the most consequential economic weekend of the 20th century. And at the time, almost nobody on Earth knew it was happening. The guest list ran to roughly 15 men. Treasury Secretary John Connally, a Texas Democrat with limitless confidence and, by his own cheerful admission, no training in international finance. Arthur Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker, the Treasury's towering Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, who had been carrying contingency plans for this exact emergency in his briefcase for months. George Shultz, the budget director, a quiet disciple of Milton Friedman who privately wanted currencies to float freely. Speechwriter William Safire, who would later write down what he saw. They were instructed to tell no one where they were going and to make no outside calls. Nixon's terror was a leak. A single premature word could have ignited the greatest bank run in history against a vault that could not pay. The debate that weekend was not really about whether to act. The numbers had made the decision, but about how much to break. Burns, the elder statesman, fought to keep the gold window open, warning that closing it would be read as default and might tear the Western alliance. He predicted retaliation and worse. Connally was for maximum boldness on every front, and Connally had Nixon's ear. The Texan's view of the world's objections was straightforward. He is reported to have told colleagues that summer that all foreigners were out to screw the United States, and that it was America's job to screw them first. Volcker, the system's reluctant undertaker, wanted the window closed only as a bridge to a rebuilt system of fixed rates. For him, this was surgery, not liberation. Schultz suspected, and kept mostly to himself, that whatever was closed temporarily would never reopen. And the secrecy held. For 2 days, the assembled brains of American economic policy argued in the lodges of Camp David, while the markets they were about to upend traded on, oblivious. By later accounts, Volcker himself remarked that a man in that room with a telephone and no scruples could have made a fortune. The knowledge in those cabins was among the most valuable information in the history of markets. It did not leak. By Sunday, the package was set, and it had 3 blades. First, the gold window would close, the United States would suspend temporarily, in the crucial phrase, the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Second, a 90-day freeze on virtually all wages and prices in America to strangle inflation while the currency adjusted, a peacetime intervention in the economy without precedent, ordered by a president who had spent his career denouncing exactly this. Third, a 10% surcharge on imports, a tariff wall thrown up overnight, designed as a crowbar to force other nations to revalue their currencies against the dollar. There remained the question of when to tell the world. Markets would open in Tokyo and Europe while America slept. Waiting even a day risked chaos. It had to be Sunday night, which meant preempting Bonanza, and the president's advisors genuinely debated whether interrupting America's favorite Western would cost more goodwill than devaluing its money. Nixon took the airtime. The speech itself was a masterpiece of framing. Nixon named the villain international money speculators, waging what he called an all-out war on the American dollar, and cast the closing of the gold window not as a default but as a defense. He barely used the word devaluation, and he offered the American public a reassurance of superb, almost hypnotic simplicity. If you buy American products in America, he said, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. Then he handed back to the networks, and the world's money was something new. Here is the strangest part, and it is worth sitting with. The announcement that severed money from gold, the event later generations would treat as an epical rupture, was greeted, in America, as a triumph. The next morning, the Dow Jones Index leapt nearly 33 points, its largest one-day gain to that date. Polls showed overwhelming public support. The freeze read as decisiveness. The surcharge read as standing up for American workers. The gold business was, to most viewers, incomprehensible plumbing. Wall Street cheered a president who had acted. Abroad, nobody cheered. European governments, blindsided, simply shut their foreign exchange markets for a week rather than trade against a currency with no defined value. Japan, hit for the second time in a month after Nixon's China announcement, kept its market open and watched its central bank swallow billions of unwanted dollars in a fortnight trying to hold the yen down. The Japanese coined a phrase for this kind of Washington surprise, the Nixon Shock. The post-war monetary order had been ended, unilaterally on television, by its own guarantor, and the Allies had learned about it along with the viewers of Bonanza. What followed was 4 months of the roughest economic diplomacy of the era, with John Connally as America's chief negotiator and chief blunt instrument. The import surcharge stayed on as a bludgeon. The Europeans and Japanese, whose economies ran on exports to America, twisted slowly. And when Europe's finance ministers complained that the crisis was America's making and America's duty to fix, Connolly gave them the answer that has outlived everything else he ever said. The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. In December 1971, at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, the wreckage was formally rearranged. The dollar was devalued, gold marked up from $35 to $38, the first change in that number since 1934. The other major currencies revalued upward, the surcharge lifted, and fixed exchange rates restored inside slightly wider bands. Nixon, never one to undersell, hailed it as the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months. Because, and this is where the story turns, the Smithsonian was a patch on a system whose engine had already been removed. Fixed rates had survived for a generation, because the gold anchor made the pegs believable, and the gold window made them payable. Now the pegs remained, but the anchor was gone. The dollar was still the center of the system, and the dollar was now backed by nothing but an American promise to behave. The speculators Nixon had denounced could read that as well as anyone, and in early 1973 they tested it. The dollar was devalued a second time, gold marked up again, to $42.22, and the run simply continued. In March 1973, the governments of the world stopped patching. The major currencies were cut loose to float against each other, their values set minute by the markets. It was meant, once again, as a temporary expedient until fixed rates could be rebuilt. They never were. A few years later, the International Monetary Fund's rules were amended to make it official, and the temporary suspension announced on a Sunday night in 1971 quietly became the permanent architecture of the world. And that is the pattern of this entire story, so let it be said plainly. Almost nothing announced as temporary that weekend ever came back. The gold window closed temporarily. It never reopened. The float was temporary. It is how every major currency works to this day. The one measure that truly was temporary, the 90-day freeze, is the one that turned into a multi-year fiasco. The freeze had worked briefly and brilliantly. Prices held. The public approved. Nixon sailed to re-election in November 1972 with the economy booming. But controls do not abolish inflationary pressure, they dam it, and behind the dam, the water was rising fast. Money and credit had grown generously into the election, and the White House tapes would later reveal Nixon pressing Arthur Burns for exactly that easy money, a pressure whose importance historians still debate but whose existence is on the recordings. When the controls were relaxed in early 1973, prices did not creep up. They exploded. A second freeze had to be slapped on within months, and this time the machinery produced open farce. With retail beef prices frozen while cattle costs soared, meat vanished from supermarket shelves, ranchers held animals off the market, and poultry farmers, unable to sell birds for what they cost to raise, reportedly drowned baby chicks by the tens of thousands. The controls were finally abandoned in 1974, having delayed inflation, distorted the economy, and discredited the whole idea for a generation. And now the dam broke over a world with no anchor at all. In October 1973 came the oil embargo, and the price of crude quadrupled within months, a blow with many causes. Though it did not help that oil was priced in dollars, and the dollar had just been devalued twice, a grievance the producers had noticed out loud. American inflation hit 11% in 1974, and the government's response, after the controls fiasco, had shrunk to pleading. Gerald Ford declared inflation public enemy number one and asked citizens to wear red buttons reading when. For whip inflation now, a campaign remembered today only as a monument to official helplessness. Inflation retreated, then surged again past 13% by 1980, the Great Inflation, the worst sustained peacetime inflation in American history. Gold, freed from its $35 cage, told the story with brutal honesty. By January 1980, an ounce briefly touched $850. And Americans could watch the verdict in person, because at the end of 1974, for the first time in more than 40 years, it had become legal for a private American citizen to own gold bullion. Roosevelt's 1933 ban quietly repealed, one more piece of the old order dismantled almost without ceremony. Measured against gold, the dollar of the Camp David weekend had lost more than 95% of its value in 9 years. Measured against groceries, the loss was slower but relentless. By official inflation figures, a dollar today buys roughly what 15 cents bought in 1971. For a while in those years, it was reasonable to wonder whether unanchored money could survive at all, whether the men of 1944 had been right that without gold somewhere in the machine, politicians would always print their way to ruin. The answer arrived through the same man who had carried the contingency plans into Camp David. In 1979, Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he proceeded to demonstrate what actually backs a fiat currency: the willingness of its institutions to defend it, at terrible cost. Volcker drove interest rates toward 20%, accepted a savage double-dip recession, and a national wave of fury, farmers on tractors blockading the Fed itself, and broke the inflation. By the mid-1980s, it was running near 3%. Paper money had passed its trial by fire, not because it was backed by metal, but because it was backed by nerve. The fates of the Camp David men scattered like a parable. Connally, the swaggering victor of 1971, switched parties, chased the presidency, went into Texas real estate, and in 1987 went spectacularly bankrupt. The man who had devalued the world's money ended up auctioning his own furniture. Burns left the Fed with his reputation chained forever to the inflation that happened on his watch. Schultz, the quiet floater, saw his heresy become the operating system of world finance and later served as Secretary of State. Volcker, the system's undertaker, became its savior and died a monetary saint. And Nixon resigned in disgrace over Watergate on the 9th of August, 1974. Almost 3 years to the day after the broadcast, the president who changed what money is was gone, and the change outlived him effortlessly. Which brings us, half a century on, to the question this entire story exists to answer: what backs the dollar now? The honest answer is, no thing backs it. There is no vault you can visit, no metal you can demand, and it must be said, the gold is still there. More than 260 million ounces of it, sitting in Fort Knox in the Fed's vaults, still carried on the Treasury's books at $42.22 an ounce. The last official price ever set, like a clock stopped at the moment of the accident. It backs nothing, it is a souvenir. What stands behind the dollar instead is a structure, less romantic than gold, and demonstrably stronger. The requirement that American taxes be paid in dollars, which conscripts the largest economy on earth into needing them. The full faith and credit of the United States government. A central bank with a legal mandate to keep the currency's value roughly stable, and since Volcker, a track record of being believed. And beneath all of it, the same substance that has backed every currency in this series, from Morgan's locked library onward, the belief of the people who hold it. The gold standard never actually escaped that dependence, it only disguised it. Gold convertibility was itself a promise, and 1971 is simply the year the promise was withdrawn and the disguise came off. Money did not stop being real on the 15th of August, 1971. It stopped pretending to be something else. So what does the Nixon Shock teach? That temporary is the most permanent word in the political dictionary. That systems do not die when their flaws are discovered. Triffin published the autopsy a decade in advance. But when the cost of pretending exceeds the cost of admitting that a reserve currency is an exorbitant privilege paid for in exorbitant obligations, and that the country at the center will, in the end, choose itself. Every holder of dollars since has been trusting that the choice will be made carefully, and that the real question about money was never what backs it, but who manages it, and whether they can be believed, because since that Sunday night in August, the belief is all there is. 50 years on, the world still runs on it. Sources for this account include the transcript of President Nixon's address of August 15, 1971, the published proceedings of the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, Robert Triffin's 1960 congressional testimony and writings, Federal Reserve and Treasury records of the period, the Smithsonian Agreement Communique of December 1971, and the memoirs and recorded recollections of participants in the Camp David meeting, including Paul Volcker, George Shultz, and William Safire.